Yeah, so I've been through a lot of the state agencies over the 14 years I've been at STG. So I've worked indirectly with some of you. In fact, I've known a couple of you guys who came up and said, hey, and I've known you guys over email and not face to face over the years. So, but all right. So a little background on me. I've rolled out Jersey at numerous clients for us. In the last 6 clients I've had, I've actually deployed a Jersey installation for their internal web services. And Gene, you said one thing that was kind of interesting to me is that you guys are discussing web service strategy. This has kind of been my primary role at the last 3 companies that I've gone through. New Skin, Workers' Compensation Fund, and then before that at the LDS Church. So we've rolled out very large-scale web service strategies for them and how to solve kind of some of the complex problems of what web services can do for you and what they bring to the table. I've been at STG for 14 years. My first contract with STG was actually at ETS, up behind the Capitol. So, and there's some stuff. I cleaned up some of the stuff in here from the UJUG. We actually are that's an interesting tidbit. We are the longest running UJUG sponsor. We used to have the very first Java user group meetings in STG's office when we were in the Triad Center. We finally grabbed that space, and now we hosted the IHC Center in Murray. It's a good group. If you guys ever want to, just sign up for the mailing list. Don't go to every session, but if something piques your interest, there's an Angular presentation that's going to be going on in a couple of months. I'm going to actually do a Spring Security presentation here, probably in 3 or 4 months. There's some good stuff that goes through there. So, all right. So why Jersey? They have the stupidest logo ever, so that's not one reason to choose them for job development. If you guys have ever seen me or have ever been involved with me, I am the biggest advocate for the Spring framework that you've ever seen. How many of you guys are familiar with the Spring framework? Pretty much all of you, okay. You will not see a bigger advocate for Spring than me. It's actually what got me into to change the way I did enterprise development with Java years ago was using Spring. I've been using it since before it was actually called Spring. It was Interface 21 back in the days. If you've followed it for very long, they used to just be a consulting group, and Spring was a framework that they rolled out. So people kind of find it strange that I'm a real big Spring advocate, but I still prefer to use Jersey over Spring. And we're going to cover some of those reasons today as to why I think it's a better tool than what Spring has to offer inside their MVC framework. So, why Jersey? First of all, it's a standard. It really is a standard. They follow the JAX-WS specification. It is a legitimate standard inside their framework. Now, that may or may not be a big deal to you. The nice thing about this is you can swap out other frameworks. Let's say you don't like something that Jersey's doing, or it's not performant for a certain problem that you have. Maybe you're doing a bunch of small requests and it doesn't work well for you. Actually, it handles that just fine, but maybe you have a large payload that you keep sending, hundreds of megs of files you're uploading, and you found out that CXF works better for you. Well, CXF is also an implementation, and you can swap out. So it's nice that it's a standard. It adheres to the standards. Kind of the same reasons why we choose to use JPA over just using Hibernate directly. All right. It is the most feature-rich of all the ones I've played with. They kind of push the features. They push the envelope with Jersey. They're great about kind of keeping up with what the standard requests are from people, which I can't say the same about a lot of the other frameworks that are out there that are part of the standard. It's a great foundation for building a client. One thing when developing web services, one thing I really don't like is when people go, oh, well, here's our WSDL, here's our waddle, so you go build the client. We just publish a WSDL file, and you just build the client. The problem with that is you're always running a client that was never tested. It was never tested by the original people that built the framework. Now let's say, oh, no, we wrote our WSDL, we tested our WSDL, we know everything that's generated from our SOAP services. I don't buy that. When I deliver software, I like to deliver a client API that's associated with it. I do that for 2 reasons. One, why should I make every developer out there regenerate that code? It doesn't make any sense to me. Two, they shouldn't actually have to know if they're using web services. The end result of using web services is that you really shouldn't have to know that you're using web services. Why make that more painful for people? So Jersey has a great tool set for building clients, and I think that's really important. It also handles security a little bit better than some of the other people that's out there as far as client side is concerned. It's got good annotations. I actually think the annotations for Jersey are better and less verbose than Spring or CXF or some of the other tools that are out there. And it's easy to get started with. You'll see we're actually going to build an application in here. So if you ever go to any of my presentations, I like to fly by the seat of my pants, so I like to do a lot of live coding. So you're going to see code today. I'm just going to walk you through PowerPoints. Why REST? So the way Gene posed the question is that you guys are thinking about your web service strategy. It wasn't thinking about REST, it was we're thinking about what we want to do in web service in general. So how many of you guys are using SOAP right now? I'm sorry. Okay, no. SOAP is actually fine, but SOAP, in my opinion, should really only be used if we are exposing something to a third party. All right, if we're going to expose something over port 80, outside of our firewall, out of a demilitarized zone, out of a DMZ, then SOAP is great. The stuff that public safety does, I worked on the stuff that was out of public safety. Every stupid consultant that went through that door told them that they should use REST, and that was actually wrong. They should not use REST at public safety. Why? They're communicating with data centers out of Georgia that have a federal standard of an XML schema backing them. Everything is standard, structured, very, very, very built around what document they're passing. SOAP is a great purpose for that. It's a great example of that. Credit card transactions. You know what? I want a SOAP envelope. I want this package. I want it very secure. I want it very stable. How that's going to be. You know what? For everything else, REST is great. Great. All right. Inter-office communication. Communication between apps. Why would I have the overhead of creating an envelope and packaging that up to send it to something else that's sitting in the same server room? It makes absolutely no sense. I can run it over SSL. It's already secure. It's less verbose, less time. I can integrate it with my UI easier. REST is a great choice for 95% of what you're doing out there. So I already asked who was considered using it this year, kind of skipped that. And we talked about Spring. So most of you guys are using Spring. And this is what kind of confuses people is why not just use the Spring outside it comes with, use the REST that comes with Spring. And it leaves a little bit to be desired of in a lot of situations. Unless you're going whole hog with Spring. And what I mean by that is, how many of you guys have looked at Spring data? Okay, not a hand. And that's where, if you're going to use Spring data, use Spring REST associated with it. Spring data is a very, very, very cool wrapper. And if you guys want to have a follow-up presentation a month from now or 2 weeks from now, ask me to come back and talk about Spring data. Spring data is one of the coolest advancements I've seen for Spring wrapping JPA and Hibernate. It eliminates all of the boilerplate code inside of your application. If you're going to use Spring data, you couple that with Spring REST, I can get a RESTful service back that represents an entity in my database in 2 lines of code. I don't have to have any of that other goo in the center. A repository tier, a service tier, my controller, all that stuff is all gone. I can just expose my JPA services as RESTful services. So we can talk a lot more about that, but like I said, if you guys want to have a presentation on that, ask me, I'll come back and do one on that. So let's look at REST a little bit. REST really isn't just HTTP verbs. So how many of you have looked at REST or have dabbled with REST a little bit? Okay, a handful of you. If you go look at the Hello World examples that are out there, they will tell you that REST was built on the HTTP servlet specification, or the HTTP specification, which is your post, get, put, delete, head, those types of HTTP verbs. I believe that was how it was meant to be built for years, 2 or 3 years, and it really isn't. We're selling ourselves short, all right? Most people just use post and get. So how many of you back in the day wrote servlets? How many of you have been playing with Java long enough to do servlets? Okay, so what was the first thing we ever did in a servlet? We overrode the do get method and sent it to do post, or we overrode the service method and sent, and just sent everything to service. And when we say that REST is centered around verbs, we're doing that same thing. We're really cheating ourselves and saying that it just deals with verbs. And it used to be the old CRUD analogy. Create was a post, read was a get, update was a put, and delete was delete. You can still think of it that way. I won't correct you, but there is more to it than that if you want to dive deeper. One thing to note, as I rattled off those 4 verbs really quick, like I said, I'm condensing a lot of information into this hour talk, so I'm trying to touch on all the points. If you use put, as I mentioned before, everybody, kind of like the servlet spec, they overrode post and get. If you use put is item put. Anybody know what item put means? It's a mathematical term.
You always get the same result no matter.
Exactly. When I call put, I can call that 1 time, I can call that 100 times. It won't change what my application's doing. Post is not item potent. If I call post 100 times, I'm going to create 100 records in my system. If I call post or put 100 times, I'm going to create it the first time. The second time, I'm going to update it if any changes were made. And the next 98 times, I'm just going to keep calling update. So I will not have 100 records. I'll only have 1 record in my system. That is the second most common mistake I see people make with RESTful services, is they don't understand why they should use put, and they just send everything through post. All right? So it's kind of, as you're thinking about architectures and how to build your application, building an API, building a RESTful service is very much building an API, and it should be thought of it that way. All right, so one last thing to talk about, and I'm not going to bring this one up again because I could spend a week talking to you about this, but this last bullet point here, hate OS or hypermedia, that is why I say that first bullet point is cheating. If you just look at HTTP verbs, you're skipping what hypermedia is and what hate OS is. And you can go read document after document about what hate OS is. There is actually a new Spring module that was released with Spring 4 that is called Spring Hate OS. All right? And that stands for hypermedia as a state it's a really stupid acronym. Hypermedia as a transfer encoded observation of application state, I think is what hate OS stands for. And long story made short, lame acronym, it's the much bigger picture of using REST how it was meant to be used. All right? And what the difference is there is that instead of the client knowing all the methods it should call, the application drives what I'll let you see. So you make a request to me, you want to find all the customers we have in our application. I'm not just going to send you back a list of customers, I'm going to send you back a list of customers with links for you to get that customer. So my client doesn't build it, my server builds it and pushes it down to you. So it's kind of a paradigm shift. But that's enough on hypermedia and hate OS. All right, so are you guys all using MAVEN? Pretty much. Anybody using Ant still? Or Gradle? Anybody using Gradle? You don't have to be embarrassed you're using Ant, it's okay. They have a really great archetype to get started with Jersey, and it's a great starting point. I really recommend it. Pretty simple to use. You just have a basic archetype that you run. We're actually going to run this today, and I'll show you how this works. The archetype itself is a good structure for your server, but to build a client, I'd build a multi-module project. Are you guys familiar with multi-module MAVEN projects? You ever done that? So with a multi-module MAVEN project, half of you are shaking your head, half aren't. With a multi-module project, I would create a parent project that actually really doesn't have any code in it. It just knows what the child projects are and how to build all of those. And one of the reasons I would do that is so that I can version everything the same. I'd have a client that's 1.0, I'd have a server that's 1.0, and then I have an API jar is how I typically do it. And that API jar, in fact, hey, that worked. So our project would say, this is our customer REST service or whatever. We'd have a customer parent project, and underneath this we'd have an API project, a client project, and a server project. And all of these allow me to keep that code separate because the client really shouldn't have the server code in it, and vice versa, the server code shouldn't have the client in it. And then the API is just our model classes that we share between the two. So this archetype's great to get you started. It's not what I would do long term for rolling out that structure of an API client server jar. All right, so let's get started. Any questions so far? Feel free to stop me as we go. Don't wait to the end because I don't want somebody with some pending question to. Yeah.
I have one question regarding when to use SOAP, when to use REST. You mentioned if third party is going to use SOAP, but I saw a lot of websites like Amazon, like Yahoo, they provide REST API.
You bet. So let me repeat her question. She said she was wondering when it is a good choice to use REST because there are a lot of sites out there like Amazon or Twitter or stuff like that that roll out RESTful services. I will tell you that I actually like REST for everything, but there are a handful. For me, the first decision is to use REST, unless there is some compelling reason not to. The example I went back to with public safety, I think is the best case there ever is for SOAP, because all right, this is a much bigger question, but I'll try and summarize it in about a minute answer, okay? The question really isn't so much as SOAP versus REST as it is XML versus JSON, all right? Now, you'll say that just because I'm using REST, it doesn't have to be XML, JSON or XML, which is true. But 99% of the time when we do a RESTful service, we're exposing JSON as the language, is the data structure that we're passing back. Doesn't have to be. SOAP is always XML. Not always is always XML, it's valid XML, it's well-formed XML, it has a schema, a structure, a DTD, whatever, it has valid structure associated with it. If I am sharing information with multiple parties, so in the case of public safety, I have courts talking to the Highway Patrol, talking to the FBI, talking to potentially the CIA or whoever. I have all this interagency information that I'm sharing. You know what? They all need to see the same structure of document. They all need that same criminal record coming back the same way. Now, when I want to create a standard that I am going to share across multiple agencies, and I may or may not have control of that standard, I want to use SOAP. So if I'm worried about standardization across multiple agencies, SOAP is a better choice. Now I can just use XML and produce XML with REST. That is a valid option, but the communication between those two isn't standard at that point. Will it work? Yeah, I can make it work, but you know what? When all these other agencies are expecting SOAP because that was the standard they've started with, and some of it's just legacy, I can't go change what the FBI's been working on for the last decade and say, hey, by the way, you guys should use REST. That's not going to fly. For every other instance, I honestly use REST. If I'm going to expose stuff to a client, I'll use REST. You know, Twitter, Flickr, all those apps where they're, especially if it's a lot of read type data, if it's 90% read, 10% push or post back to the server, you bet it's going to be REST. It's going to be REST without a doubt. That answer pretty good? Okay, so let's build a client and import it into Spring, and we're going to hit it with this URL. All right, so you're going to see this. You're going to see this kind of go in action here. And I'll walk through some of the folder structure that's associated with this. So let's go into Spring STF. How many of you guys use Spring STS? One or two. What do you guys use? Eclipse, IntelliJ, NetBeans? Eclipse? For those of you using Eclipse, I will tell you to use Spring STS. It is Eclipse with all the plugins already installed and all the headaches ironed out. So if you've ever fought installing a Subversion client and trying to figure out which one you should use, the Polaris one or the Tigris or whatever, all that stuff's done for you. So it's much easier, much better to just use Spring STS. If you're using NetBeans, I'm sorry. And IntelliJ, there's no reason to pay for it. So, all right, let's get to a folder structure here. Java. And this is the same archetype I had on the board earlier. It's right off their webpage. If you go to that's an interesting note. If you go to download Jersey, you go to their website, they tell you to download it through the archetype. There really isn't anything for you to download. So if you go to Jersey's webpage, jersey.java.net, and go to download, they tell you to download their starter application using this archetype. So this is the direction they recommend you go to. So when we pull this up, it's just a standard archetype. It goes through, builds some MAVEN structure. Oh, what's that all about? Oh, it can't hit it because I'm not logged into the server, which is fine. I already have it downloaded. So let's just do gov.utah. For our artifact ID, let's do state-rest-example. And then everything else is just the standard, yes, I agree to everything. Great. So now that's done. I've already built this application. I'm going to go through here and import it. And this is one of the other nice things about Spring STS that you don't have with MAVEN. I already have it with Eclipse. I already have the MAVEN plugins installed. So what you're seeing is my configuration out of the box with Spring STS. So I have this import existing MAVEN project in. I don't have to go add the M2E plugins in. So I can select that one, browse, and go to Java UJUG and this state rest example, and click open. And it'll go through and it'll examine it. It finds my POM and already sets up my structure for me. So all my class path, build path, source folders, all that stuff's already done for me. I can click finish. It'll import it. And voila, we've got our basic project here. Now, as you've already used MAVEN, you can tell I've already got my source main Java, source main resources, my MAVEN dependencies. I also have my source main web app, web.inf, web.xml folder structure. This has nothing to do with this class, but I'm going to point out something to you because it always catches people by surprise. When you go to the Java Servlet Specification 3.0, this folder structure goes away. You no longer have a web.xml. You don't have to have a web.xml with the Servlet Spec 3.0. So if you start seeing apps as they're trickling through, because I'm starting to see them come through now, examples that are 3.0 and later, and actually 3.1's actually already out, you'll start to see, you'll go on an application and go, hey, there's no web.xml. I'm used to seeing a web.xml file. How's this running? It's because they're doing it through initializers and imports and annotations and other stuff like that. So don't be surprised if you start seeing applications now that don't follow this structure. All right, so now that we've got this project going, I'll just open up the web.xml to show you a couple of things. They have configured the Jersey servlet for you, and they've also configured that line right there that says gov.utah, that is the package, the provider packages. If you try to go configure your own application, I will bet you $100, every one of you, that you'll forget that line of code because I've watched everybody do it 101 times. And that just tells it what package to start looking for your web services in. And then down below, we're hitting our URL pattern as web API, so we have to have web API and all of them. You can change that to REST or services or whatever you want, but that's their default as web API. All right, now I'm going to go through and add this to a Tomcat server. This is just a simple Tomcat 7 server. By the way, they released Tomcat 8 the other day, which is why I bring up the Servlet 3.0 specification stuff, is because it's all 3.0 compliant and everything now. Now, add this project. Add and finish. And start this guy up. Now, I always watch my server start up to make sure that there's no errors that pop up there. Now, granted, we just got this thing set up. It should be fine, but it looks great. We finished off with server started up in 1341 and no errors, just some infos rolling off of there. We open up our browser, and we have the last example I was running to make sure that this was all happy before we came here. If I go to, oh, no, get rid of the solution. There we go. Voila. Isn't that great? I can now got it back from my server. Let's make this actually do something. So this, just to recap what this did, this hosted out of their source main Java, gov.utah, my resource, which they call their resources, their RESTful service is a resource, whatever. You can change the naming convention to whatever you want. This is all it took to do that web service. This is why I like Jersey, all right? See that @path annotation at the top? That's the annotation that gets us the URL to our RESTful service. And then we have this @get annotation. This is my favoriteest thing about Jersey, is their annotation is @get. If you use Spring MVC, it's @request mapping, open parenthesis, double quote, value equals the URL that you want to go to, close double quote, comma, request method, dot, get, blah, blah. I mean, it's this big, long, nasty string to do the same thing of @get. All right, so this is a lot simpler to read. It's a lot easier to see what it's got going on. Now, the other thing that you notice that this right now currently produces text underscore plain. So this is just going to dump out a simple text object. So what got displayed to my screen was text plain. It wasn't even HTML, just text. Let's talk about what else we can do with that. All right, so for our first app, we covered the structure, we looked at the web.xml, we did the produces, consumes, and we actually looked at the HTTP method. That was a get. The @get sign was the HTTP method. Before we go any further, though, I want to point out one thing. This works just fine with Spring. So I can still tie Spring in on the background. It's not like if I've gone Jersey, now I can't use Spring. No. I can put my context loader listener inside my web.xml, fire up Spring, and start injecting those resources into, I can do dependency injection right into my classes that I have defined inside of REST. So just because I'm doing, inside of Jersey, just because I'm doing Jersey doesn't mean I can't use Spring. It works just like a Spring MVC controller. You configure it exactly the same. So, Spring versus Jersey, I kind of talked about this, but look at the verbose nature of what I've got with the Spring controller over here. And this is a small example, so it doesn't look that enticing. Trust me, as they get more complex and they get bigger, it just gets noisier. So I have to grab the model, I have this model attribute, I'm returning the string below here, I've got my request mapping. Notice the example on the left doesn't even say which type of method, which HTTP method I'm using. So over here in Jersey, I've got get. Over here, I haven't even defined get. I'd have to change that request mapping to do a comma, request method equals get. So you start to see that this gets a lot noisier doing this in Spring on the left than it does in Jersey on the right. So let's add something to our path now. Let's make our path do something a little bit more than, great, I did a hello world example and it worked. Woohoo, great, I did a vending framework. Let's start utilizing some of the resources. So when you're using a RESTful service, we talked about get, post, put, delete, all the different HTTP verbs that are in there. Well, one of the things we can do is your URL defines where you're at in your application or what entity you're looking at. You should center it around nouns. Your URL should be centered around nouns, not necessarily verbs. Verbs are what you do with it. Nouns are the domain of which you're working with. So our URL right now looks like http://localhost :8080 ours is state rest. Should have chosen a smaller URL. Example /web API. And now we're into what our domain is. Right now we're looking at my resource. This could have been customer, it could have been driver's license, it could have been DMV renewal, whatever you want to call it. Right now we have my resource. And we want to tack on some value to the end of that. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4. And what this means is, in my resources, if I just ask for my resources, this should return me all of the resources I have in the system. You know, I may have 100, I may have 1,000. Obviously, we would want to limit those if we had a large set of them. 1, 2, 3, 4 says I want to specifically go get, if I'm using @get, domain object 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. So let's see how you do that using Jersey. Now, all we have to do is go inside of our application, and for our individual method, it concatenates our path that we have up above to the one we have down below. So if we want to do @path and say, so it should be @path, and we want resource ID. And I am doing this 100% from memory. I was right anyways, I should just trust myself. We can put in here @path param and name this path param. So we want to do something like resource ID here. That's all we have to do to grab values off of our URL. Pretty simple. All right. So now it's going to redeploy for me automatically, which it did. And I can come through here and tack on 1, 2, 3, 4 to the end of that URL, and voila. All right. See how simple and just nice and easy this is to use? And by the way, it's just as simple to do a post and grab parameters off of a post. I know we won't have time to get to a post today, but it's equally as simple. I can post to an object, have it bind to an object. It'll automatically fill those values for me. It'll do conversions for me. If it doesn't know what to do with conversion, I can use a converter object. It's really simple, and I cover that in this class here. All right, so we talked about the path. Now, this is one of my key hot buttons. All right, this, in my opinion, is where everybody messes up REST. Everybody, including Spring MVC. It's the response object. So, who can tell me the difference between well-formed XML and valid XML?
Valid XML has an end, but well-formed is where it has an end tag for everything.
Yep.
Valid XML is where it fits the schema and it actually
Bingo.
fits correctly.
So, just to cement that idea in there, is HTML well-formed? No. Inside of HTML, I can do a BR tag and never close it. Where valid HTML, well-formed HTML, would have a closing tag for it, or I would close and be done. So the difference between valid and well-formed is well-formed means I close every element that I have, and valid means that it adheres to some schema or some DTD or some structure that's supporting it. All right. Same thing goes with RESTful responses. This is the best analogy I can make to RESTful responses. If I ask for my resource 1, 2, 3, 4, and it doesn't exist, what should I do? Should I give them a 404 not found error? Or did they make a successful request? My request was successful, but I'm going to return you back a not found. I'm going to return you back some error message. And I will tell you, I don't care, but handle it. One way or another, whichever way you choose, this is part of making a standard, handle it. I actually prefer what you're referring to, and that is to use these response codes. We have these response codes. Let's use them. So if I ask for an object and it doesn't exist, I'm going to give you a 404 error. If I try to do an operation and I can't do it because I'm unauthorized, I'm going to get a 401 back. Or if technically that is a 403. If I'm not authenticated, I'm going to get a 401. So I have these nice, really well-built error codes into the HTTP specification. Use those for what they're there for. Without a doubt, 9 out of 9 applications I go to don't do this right. Every application I've ever been to that's done REST, they skip this part. And it's just like exception handling in Java. If you have a problem and you want to throw an exception, how many people swallow the exception and then do some stupid return code and their application has to get smart around, if I return you a customer and it's null, that meant I couldn't find it. But if I return you one and it's of this type, then that means we found it but you don't have permission. You start doing all this weird mumbo jumbo in your application when we have these really nice exceptions. Let's just throw that exception and handle it and move forward. Same thing, we have these response codes. Let's throw these response codes appropriately and utilize them. That's what they're there for. All right, so with that, a valid response is something that is valid and it returns something. Okay, and Jersey has this really slick built-in utility to build a response automatically. So I can say response.ok. What do you think OK is? Anybody know their HTTP codes? 200. That's right. So if I say response.ok, it automatically sends back a 200 response, and I can then associate an entity with it. That's how easy it is to build a valid response and follow the structure that's there. So it works really well to use those built-in error codes, and they provide you a facility to do that. So let's do that in our application. And by the way, our application is getting more RESTful, because as it started out, it was returning a text plain object, which I wouldn't really call that RESTful, because you're kind of supposed to deal with objects in REST and we're returning a string. So let's go inside our application. I'm going to stop this real quick. And inside of this, let's return a response object. And there is, you got to be careful because there's a couple in here. We want the JaxW response object. And you'll notice it immediately starts to complain at me. So we want to return response.ok, and then we can add an entity to that. And right now we can still return our string. So let's just return resource ID. And the last thing you have to do is build it. So it is the builder pattern. If you're familiar with the builder design pattern, this is a builder design pattern. It's building our response and hand our response object back to us. So now we can save this. If I fire up this server, make sure there's no errors in the console. Oh, looks good. Let's go back here and ask for this. It still returns 1, 2, 3, 4. Perfect. Except now we're doing it correctly. We are returning a valid 200 error response code, which actually isn't an error, we're a valid response code, and we're returning our entity of 1, 2, 3, 4. All right? So that's how easy it is to build an accurate, true response from our server. Now, an invalid response is something that was valid and does not return something. So their call made it to my server, but they didn't ask for something appropriately or whatever. And this is where I like to use the various status codes that's in there. And you see it's really easy. I got a response.status. So instead of OK, I return a .status of status not found, which is going to put the appropriate 404 not found page in there. And then I can still hand them back an entity. So that's the beauty of this. I still get to return data with them saying, hey, you're searching for this. I don't have that. So I can build a nice UI structure around this is what you're asking for, and it's not found. I don't have that. So I can give the user more feedback about what they're doing right or wrong in our application. So the response codes are great. I like them a lot. All right, let's talk about produces consumes. And this is, in my opinion, where Jersey shines. I've got @get post, and then I have also the produces consumes. Now I've tied those together, the get and the post, even though it's not really produces consumes. Get should be for reads, and post should be where it's consuming. So I'm kind of showing you an example of @get might be what the produces, and @post might be what the consumes, although it's not necessarily a one-to-one mapping. But you can see how I start to tie these two together. I can have a method, I don't know why you'd want to normally do this, but I can have a method that consumes XML and produces JSON. You can, and it's pronounced JSON, it's not JSON, just so if you ever wondered that, it's JSON. There's not an extra vowel in there. I can tie in this produces consumed very easy to what our application is producing. So let's actually take and switch our app right now that's returning a string to return an object, to return some valid object. So let's go inside of our app. And one thing I don't like that Jersey does is it puts your resources, their little archetype puts the resources right under your package. I would put that in a REST package or a controller package. I like the controller package, but I sometimes name it REST too, because you know it's a REST service. So I'm going to just create a new package here and do gov.utah.model, and we'll throw like a person object in there. Normally the service and the model would be named the same, but just for sake of time, we'll throw a person object in there. Say new class, new person. I have no idea why this thing is still bouncing down here. Killed it a dozen times. And we'll do private string name and private int age. Source. Our resolution is really low. Generate getters and setters. Okay, so now we've got a basic person object. Nothing too sophisticated going on there, which is standard basic person object. And I can come over here, and I'm going to change this to do a produces media type of application JSON. And you can see, I'm just using the context-sensitive help here, you can see that they have everything imaginable here. I have applications that produce PDFs out of my RESTful service call. You make a RESTful service call to it, I can dump out an octet stream and hand you a PDF right out of it. Works like a champ. So I'm going to do an application JSON response. And let's now, since we're here, just to really illustrate this, let's create a person object and return that entity instead of returning our simple string that we have. Do person equals new person. And let's just say person dot set name. Well, let's set age first. 37. Person dot set name. And we'll do Bryan. And then when we build our resource down here, we can add person into this. And I will tell you, I'm actually skipping ahead because we're running out of time. I can tell you that this is going to break. And this is one of my pet peeves I have with every framework out there, not just Jersey. The first time we run this, it's going to break, and I'll show you why. So here's our my resource 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, okay, I broke it like I said I was going to. And you'll see this weird error message that says application JSON type class, yada, yada, yada. It cannot find a message body provider. All right, let me show you how I fix this. Now, you'll notice we said application JSON, right? Everybody agrees that says JSON right there. How I fix this is I come in my person object and I say @XML root element and save that. Now, when this deploys, take it a second there. Okay, done reloading. Oh, no, I skipped too far ahead. My COM file up. I have to uncomment Okay, there you go. There's JSON. All right. Now, to show you this, let me go back in here again. Go to my person object. Comment this guy out. Save it. And refresh this once it reloads. Faster than it is. I've fixed it now. Okay, let me ask you why I have to have that XML root element at the top of my class to return JSON.
Yes.
Do you know why?
Because it needs to be marked. I'm not sure.
Okay, I will tell you why. No, I guarantee you won't guess it. All frameworks, CXF, Spring, Jersey, all frameworks out there to convert your object to JSON, first convert it to XML. All right? And you'll go, that seems stupid. Why would I do that? I agree it's stupid, but here's why they did it. For years, we worked on DOM4J, the Xerces parsers, the Xalen engines for XML. We've used all these XML engines out there for years and perfected them to convert from Java objects to XML. Well, once I have all of my data in XML, how much easier is it to convert it to JSON? It's a piece of cake. And so what they did is rather than go through and recreate all these JSON parsers, they just convert your object from Java to XML and then from XML to JSON. So you'll start seeing weird stuff where if I want to rename a field that gets returned, like right now in our UI, I have age and name. Okay, it's just taking these names here are properties, and that's what it's returning. If I want to rename those, I use the XML element tag to give it a different name to produce a different name in my UI. So it's kind of a stupid thing that's left over from legacy, but that's why it's there. So if you start seeing examples, you're going, no, I'm doing JSON, I'm not doing XML. You do still play with XML, you just don't know you're playing with XML. All right. So let's get back over to our slides because we're just about out of time. We did the XML root element. All right, client. I've got 5 minutes, and I'm going to run you through the client example within that 5 minutes. I actually got about 3 minutes, but we'll make it happen. I really like Jersey's clients. One thing to note about Jersey clients, if you read any of the documentation, they'll say that they're not really suitable for production use. It's not true. Just don't initialize your clients every time. If you're using something like Spring, or you want to create your own singleton, or however you want to do your initialization, I don't care. If you want to store it in some static variable, makes no difference to me. Don't initialize your client every time. That's why you'll read that Jersey clients aren't used for production usage. They're fine. They're easy to test and ship with a UI, with an API. It's one of my pet peeves that I mentioned earlier is that you should always ship your application, I don't care if it's SOAP or REST, ship it with an API. I shouldn't have to know how to use your WSDL or Waddle. You can export Waddle out of Jersey as well. If you haven't looked at Waddle before, it's the same. It's WSDL for Jersey as Waddle. All right. So our client is really easy to build and really easy to unit test. You can see all I do, I mean, I can run it. It's not going to make a whole lot of difference since we are out of time. I just build the URL, ask for it as JSON, it returns it, and I can look to see if I got a 200 response code back. All right, real simple. All the stuff we did on the server, I can replicate in the client and make sure that our response worked well and was a valid response. And then you can see I can get the string out of it, or I can grab the person object out of it, and I'm ready to rock and roll at that point. So it's 12 o'clock. If you guys want me to write the client, I can. I don't want to take you guys from your lunch break. It's up to you guys. It makes no difference to me. Nobody's opposing. I'm writing the client. That's just because I like writing code. So I'm going to come up here and right-click on Gov Utah and create a new package. And I'm going to do .client. Now this is where, if you remember, at the MAVEN slides, I was saying that I would have a separate project. I would do a MAVEN multi-module project. I normally would not put this code all in the same WAR file or jar file. That's my disclaimer. Now, let's create a new class and do my client. And we'll just click finish on it. And inside of here, I'll pull up my cheat sheet. Inside of here, we're going to do a couple of things. We're going to create a new instance of client, private client, and I'm just going to organize those imports. There we go. And we'll say public my client, and we want to do client is equal to client builder dot new client. And this client builder is where if you have security wrapped around here, if you're doing like basic security or digest security, you can pass that stuff in during this builder phase right here. We don't have any security wrapped around ours right now, but it works. So let's do public person get, and we'll pass in a string ID, and we want to go ahead and set up our web target. If you look at old examples of Jersey, this just recently got easier. So if you're looking at other stuff and you see that they use different interfaces or different classes or whatever, it's because with the latest release of Jersey, it all just got easier. It used to be a lot more verbose. So we'll say target is equal to client.target. We can pass in this link. See that first option that I have selected there? Link refers to the hypermedia HateOS stuff. All right, that was another recent addition that they did. So it's not referring, it is referring to a web link, but not in the sense that you're thinking. It's referring to one that's returned from a hypermedia request. So do string, and we want to do http://localhost://state-rest-example/web API/ and we'll just stop there. And close that guy off. And then we want to grab our response object. Now remember, be careful with which response object you choose because you got 3 that are automatically going to come up. Response is equal to target.path, and we want to do the path to our resource. We'll do my resource, which is our web service. And there's some things you can do with their string builder, but this works just fine for this example. Plus ID. We're going to take the ID that we pass in here, and then we want to do a dot request, and we're going to pass in here media type dot JSON. Oh, there we go. Application JSON. Got it myself. And then this is where it signifies what we're doing. We are doing a GET request. So the method is GET. If I was doing a post, it would be a post, head, put, delete, so on and so forth. So I'm going to say GET, and the return type is response.class. Screen for you. I'm still not going to be able to get it to fit on one page. Now, we can check. We wouldn't have to. We can run it how it is. We can check to say response.get status, and we can, if that doesn't equal 200, we'll throw a runtime exception. Throw a new runtime exception, and we're just going to get response.get status, and just add whatever on here. obviously you probably not want to give that back to your user, but you get the idea. And return response dot read entity, and it's a person dot class. Save that. That's it. Our client is built. I'm going to throw together a unit test really quick just to execute this, but this client is built. So we would go in here and say new JUnit test case, and we'll do my resource test, and I'll throw it alongside of here. Normally I put it in its own package, but we're making it happen. And for here, all we want to do is go through and just do a my client. My client? Yeah, my client. Equals new my client. My client dot get 4, and this is going to return a person object. Equal to that. And for this basic example, we're just going to assert that it's not null. So assert not null person. Oh, that's a string. Mine would be a string. Okay, so there's our unit test. And why is it complaining? Okay, it's all happy now. Now we can run it. There's a JUnit test. And hey, it worked. Yeehaw. If I pull this back into the browser, though, because of the way that it's built, it will still work just fine. And then one other quick thing I'll show you is Postman. I can throw Postman out here for the URL and do a get, and you can see that same response back. As you're testing these RESTful APIs, Postman is a great tool if you're not writing your own client. So, all right. That's everything I got for you guys. Sorry I went over a couple minutes, but there you go.